Hi, I'm Pedro, and today's video is about creating chromatic harmony in your music. So this is a whole world in itself, and used with taste, it can take your music to all sorts of places, especially if you are the kind of composer that seeks to introduce novelty and surprise in the music that you make. But because it's such a big subject to cover, I'll just give you a taster for the things that you can start using and experimenting with right away. We'll be looking at some ways to harmonize chromatic harmony lines and also how you can create chromatic harmony using borrowed chords, secondary dominants, and voice leading. Ready? Let's go! Very briefly, chromatic harmony occurs when the used chords or melody in a given passage contain notes that do not belong to the tonality we are working with. And that's it. As an example, if you are working in the key of C major, and if an F sharp sneaks in, you are now creating a passage with chromatic harmony, or melody. As mentioned, we'll be looking at two scenarios that you're likely to find. The first is when you already have a chromatic line that you want to harmonize, and the other one is when you may or may not have a melody beforehand to be harmonized. Alright, so for the first scenario, in these next examples I included pedal notes placed at the top and at the bottom, the F sharp and the B respectively. And of course, a chromatic descending line from B to F in the middle register. This is the material we are working with before we start the harmonization process. I explored two ideas to harmonize this setup. The first one was to use two chords that, when played alternately, would cover that note from the descending chromatic line. In this case, I chose the B minor 7 and the E9 sharp 11. The last chord you hear is an E minor, which could be the tonality I would be going for in the following section. So to prepare the change, I tonicized it with a B altered chord. The second option I explored was to simply double the descending chromatic line in major thirds. And since I'm doing parallel motion, I decided to experiment with adding an extra minor third above the descending line to thicken the melody. All in all, it's just harmonic planing using a major chord all the way down, while using the same pedal note on the bass to keep the harmonic color grounded to that B. Now let's explore another way to create chromatic harmonies by mixing two key centers. Another way to create chromatic harmonies is by using two key centers that, when put together, can include the chromatic descending line from B to F in this case. I used D and E flat major keys, and I must say that I went over the top, as when you put the notes of both scales together, including common tones of course, you'll get the full chromatic scale. And as for the harmonization process, I chose to have a chord every 2 beats to follow the descending chromatic line. I picked chords either from D major or E flat major, but I did something else as well. Because we meshed the two scales together, we can now create chord structures with notes from both keys, while using their respective available chords as a reference. Let's say I have a D major chord. I can change it into D minor by replacing the F sharp with the natural F from E flat major. Or the same D major chord with an A flat, which would be like a D major with an added sharp 11. This way you can have chords that don't necessarily exist in either of the keys, but can be very handy for the harmonization process. This type of interaction is also interesting for polytonal contexts, but I'll leave that to another time. And with that said, let me show you what I did to harmonize the same descending chromatic line. I ditched the pedal notes and replaced it with a melody instead. The only thing that I should add is that the G flat 9 chord before the E minor 9 is the result of harmonic planing from the E flat 9, the same chord moved up a minor third essentially, and not from the result of mixing the chords of two keys, although it could since we have the full chromatic scale, so anything goes. Of course, there are other tools that you could use to harmonize this type of musical context. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, this is a big subject and we are just touching the surface here. But very briefly, here are 3 other ways that are arguably more common to harmonize a chromatic line. Using descending fifth sequence with dominant chords, alternating between major and diminished chords, or with chromatic medians. Alright, so let's proceed with the second scenario, where we have a melody to be harmonized or not and create some chromatic harmonies. In this setup, that is in the key of E minor, I created a melody already including some chromaticism, and then I harmonized it by choosing target chords every 2 bars, and thus leaving space to tonicize these chords on a second pass, using secondary dominants and voice leading to introduce even more chromaticism in the key, and generate more harmonic movement overall. Remember, even if you don't have a melody, you can follow this exact same process. Now, regarding the target chords themselves, I chose them taking in consideration the notes of the melody, of course, but I must say that in this first harmonization pass, I used a couple of borrowed chords from E melodic minor and from D major to better accommodate the tone for the chromatic passages in the melody. So the first chord I chose was the E minor 9, which you can also look at it as being the 6th degree of the G major key. The second one was the C major 9, the 4th degree of the same key. The next 2 other chords I picked were the C sharp half diminished with the natural 9, the 6th degree of E minor melodic, and B minor 7 add 11, also the 6th degree but from the key of D major. Here's what I had so far. Now that I had a general harmonic direction, I started to work out which other chords I could use in between the target chords. As I mentioned, I primarily used voice leading to help me connect chords through the chromatic movement, and also secondary dominants and other dominant substitutions to guide the tonicization process. I colored the notes in the piano roll so you can see the target chord separated from the resulting chords of this second harmonization pass. Notice how the chord voices are moving. The trick to ensure good voice leading is generally to use common tones between chords as possible and try to reduce the chord voices movement to half or a whole step. So basically what you do is to play with this aspect and use these small gestures to add a bit of harmonic movement or create little chord melodies if you prefer to think that way, which will help you to prepare for and create smoother passages from one chord to the other. So in between E major 9 and C major 9, the 2 target chords, I used the G sharp half diminished to lead me to a G7 add 13, a secondary dominant, which I then altered to a G9 flat 13 and resolved it to the target chord C major 9. Again, remember that voice leading justifies many of the chords that are being created throughout this example. After the C major 9, I proceeded with the F7 sharp 11, which I momentarily altered to an F9 add 13 and back to create some harmonic movement, right before using the B7 altered to target the C sharp half diminished. Functionally, although it approaches its target chord from a step down, this is not a typical backdoor dominant, which would normally resolve to a major chord. The usage of this chord is only justifiable, again, due to the voice leading to the next chord. After this, I chose the F sharp altered that succeeds chromatically from the C sharp half diminished. And then its chord voices settle on an F sharp 7, sharp 5 with an E on the bass, a secondary dominant that resolves to the target chord B minor 7. And what happens next is the result of adding a chromatic melodic line above the chord structures. Meanwhile, I kept the pedal point on B in the bass, sustaining the harmonic tension as it approaches its resolution. So the harmonization process revolved around choosing as much as possible to have chord tones moving chromatically to the next chord tone and resolve to the target chord in a similar manner. The produced chords after the B minor 7 and over the B pedal note are the F sharp minor 6, C7, and F sharp diminished 7. The target chord was the G major 9. And for effect, here is the full example, this time with the melody included. You could definitely develop this into another section, as the G major 9 chord suggests, but my challenge to you is that you pick it up from here and maybe try it yourself using these ideas. The tools are here, now it's your turn to explore and make them your own. And what I really hope is that you come out inspired by this video and go make new music. Incidentally, and since I used a similar approach here, I have a blog post that you might want to read. It deals with using common chord progressions as target chords or guideposts. Alright, so if you want to learn more about harmonizing melodies or creating chord progressions, check out the Beyond Music Theory book or the online courses, Creating Unique Chord Progressions and Mastering the Art of Harmonizing Melodies. All the links are in the description below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and until next time.